Hello and welcome to the Child Psych Funcast.
I'm Tammy.
And I'm Tania. We're registered psychologists, registered play therapists, founders of the Institute of Child Psychology, and most importantly, mums who are here today to talk about the great debate surrounding sleepovers.
We have kids that range anywhere from 6, 10,
Yeah,
to
mine is 6,
6,
nearly
6,
7. Don't get that wrong, nearly 7.
nearly 7, all the way to 17. So I think at this point, we're in the thick of either considering sleepovers or starting sleepovers in our home. And this has been something we've done some social media about. And I thought, this would make a really good podcast for parents who are considering it. And we're here to kind of play both angles. And then parents can make, a decision on what they think is best for their family. And so we're not saying we're anti or pro. We're just going to give you the facts and give you the perspectives. And if you decide to be anti sleepover, you can do that. Or if you want to be pro sleepover, we're going to talk about ways to do that safely if that's what your family decides to do.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Give away my age here, but kind of as an 80s baby, there was no debate over sleepovers. At a certain point, you just got invited to a friend's house and you went over for a sleepover. And now I think for parents, there's so much kind of tension around what should I do? Do I, don't I? Am I a good parent? Am I not a good parent? If I do, I don't. I think there's so much pressure around this topic.
Yeah, and I think there are cons and there are pros. And I mean, in the age of social media, we know so much more than we did, and our parents were doing the best they could. But I think of some of the sleepovers I had, and oh dear, like we were definitely doing things we shouldn't have done. And my parents did not know the parents at all. Like, I don't know if they could have told you their first name. They just knew where the address was, and they had me call them when I got there and call to pick up in the morning. But again, this is the age now of social media. And I think there's just so much more awareness on what could go wrong. So I think we can talk about that a little bit, and also some things that I know I've put in place, because I do have one kiddo who's doing sleepovers, so we can chat about that and how that works. But I think when we think like sleepovers, there are the pros. And I think pro parents to sleepovers, they say things like, well, you can't control everything. It was one of my favorite parts of my childhood, like, which I understand. I mean, I have many really great memories of sleepovers that I don't want to discount, but I also know I got into a lot of trouble during sleepovers as a teenager. And there were things that happened that probably shouldn't have happened that weren't great. No abuse or anything, but still, like, just a lot of kids being kids and bullying and, sneaking out and all this kinds of stuff when I was a tween and a teen, right? And these are kids get that herd mentality when they're together. And I've seen it hosting sleepovers at my house is when you get a group of kids together and they're overnight, you get a very different vibe than when it's just like maybe one or two kids. Like it's a lot different. And my husband noticed this when we had a sleepover for my daughter's birthday. And we'll talk about how we set that up. But I think that's like the pros, is being like, another thing we could think about is like, kids then get to see how other houses are run. They get to see other cultures. It makes them more adaptable. If they're a little anxious, maybe it allows them to try new, like, hard things and kind of, so I don't know, there are some things that we could definitely say that could help a child. I think in terms of maybe a little more gritty and being more open-minded. And so I think if maybe a parent's having a hard time letting go, this would be a good practice, to have them, leave them for a little bit if that's difficult. So any other pros you can think of? Because I'm just trying to think of making sure we're not criticizing parents who choose to do this.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that stands out for me is probably the resilience of it. It's a kind of, I did it. I was able to spend the whole night. I kind of immersed myself in somebody else's family, which is also, it's, like you said, culture, family, all those things, immersing yourself into different experiences. I think very often as a society, we've become quite segregated and individualized. This is what we do, and this is our family, without actually going, how does the rest of the world work? What does it look like at dinner time in somebody else's family? What does bedtime look like in somebody else's house? And I think our children really benefit from being exposed to different ways of doing things. And I think that that becomes a part of their personality, their understanding of the world. So I think that when we protect too much, when we hold too closely, we do sometimes run the risk of almost having our children live in little boxes without enough exposure to the world. So I think there's a beautiful amount of exposure. And then I also think there's that resiliency of the next morning going, I did it. I spent the whole night and I learned a whole lot of new things. And now I'm back with my family and that's wonderful. But I learned something and I did something that was hard and probably quite scary. So I see those two, they're both huge. And I see those two as the biggest pros of having kids sleep out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think before we go any further, just so you know, I'm okay with sleepovers, and Tan is, are you on the anti, or like not, you're not ready? Like, where are you? Like right
Yeah.
now? You're kind of like
Yeah.
on the,
No, we're definitely not a sleepover family right now.
yes, right now.
But we can chat that that might be shifting a little bit, and I want to talk to parents about that too. But right now, we're on the no sleepovers.
Yeah, we just passed the threshold where we're considering it, and that my daughter is 11. So that's where we're considering it, is 11 years old. But we did allow her at 9 in our home, if that makes sense. Like,
Yep.
again, and we'll talk about what that looked like in the families that we knew really well, that we were able to do that. But just so you know, like, this is a no judgment zone for parents, that Tan and I do things a little bit differently, and that's okay. But I come, we're going to talk about the cons here, and knowing these cons, how I've decided to navigate this is probably with as much education as I can to prevent harm, to any of the kiddos, which
Yeah.
came at a cost to my sleep most of the time.
We actually, when the girls were younger, we had a close family friends, and we did do a couple of sleepovers. They were little as well. I can't believe that we allowed it so little. They were probably 4 and 6, and they actually slept over there. And they did it twice. On the second time, Una called us at 10 o'clock at night and had to come home. And she said, "Mom, I just don't want to do sleepovers anymore. Please don't make me do any more sleepovers." And we actually took a step back. It was way too early, but we took a step back and said,
Yeah.
"Okay, we're going to pause it for right now."
Yeah. And I mean, we had some when the kids were younger with cousins and stuff, but that was a little bit different, right? With close family and grandparents and things like that. But we're talking, I think we're both talking about other families. We're not talking about like our aunts and uncles and
No,
grandparents.
we're talking about
We're
other
talking
families.
more about other
Friends.
families within our communities.
Yeah.
So I think what comes up for me, of course, is safety. And I know a lot of more sleepover parents say things like, you really never know what's going on behind closed doors. I don't trust my children with adults. I don't really know, which is legitimate, right? Is we don't know the level of supervision in someone's home. We don't know what their house rules are. We don't even know maybe who's living in the home. Are there adolescents in the home?
Is
So
it
I think
alcohol? Yeah.
alcohol, drugs, screens, like we don't know, both Tania and I are pretty pragmatic and have a lot of boundaries around screens and internet. We don't know the rules in other people's homes when it comes to that, whether kids have access to pornography, social media, and our kids don't have social media. So I think that is something that I have considered. Also, some kids just aren't ready to be apart all night, and we may push them into something they're not quite ready for inadvertently. Like Tania said, they get homesick and then you have to go pick them up at 11 o'clock at night. Just a lot of those pieces that we have to consider. What are your thoughts kind of on?
Yeah. A big, big, big one for me. There's two. So the first one is technology. So obviously we want to really be aware of, well, there's three actually. So one is just protecting our kids. The second is technology. So as you mentioned, Tam, we've got pretty tight rules around tech. And we know, for example, that the average age of exposure to online pornography is about 11 years old now. And I just want to know what my children are being exposed to. I want to have that control. And I think the moment we kind of open up a sleepover, we don't know. It's hours and hours and hours of not having access to your child, not knowing what the supervision looks like. Even if we've asked those important questions that we're going to talk about soon, it's too long for me to be comfortable with at this point. And then the third one is that attachment piece, is I think children have to be ready to spend that amount of time away from family. And I think that we can have a lot of the joy and a lot of those childhood experiences without necessarily pushing them into a full sleepover. And that's something that we've done at home now, is that we let the girls stay all the way up until bedtime. They actually, with one of the little friends, Maya took her pajamas and her toothbrush. She got into her pajamas there. She brushed her teeth. And then I picked her up right at bedtime. and brought her home. And it was so much fun. They had so much fun without all of the pressure of having to sleep over.
Absolutely. And one of the things we did a podcast and a summit interview, it was about a month and a half ago. Maybe it was longer, this regardless. One of the things I learned, and I knew that this was an issue being a trauma therapist, because a lot of the sexual trauma that I have worked with over the years has been peer to peer, which means it's not adults abusing kids, it's peers, like their friends enacting sexual things with one another. And it used to be like in 1992, I believe it was only 40% of the sexual abuse was peer to peer. The 60% was adult to adult, or so adult to child. And in 2022, that stat rose to 70%. So if children are sexually abused, it's more likely to be from a child who's a minor than an adult. So when we think of a sleepover, this, and I have worked with kids who have gone to sleepovers and this is what has happened, that makes me really nervous as a parent, knowing that statistic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I didn't know what the number was until we did that interview. And then I was like, okay, this makes sense. This is what we're seeing in the clinic as well. When it comes to kids coming in for treatment, and when I supervise clinicians at the sexual assault center, this is what they're seeing. It's often other kids doing this, whether it's daycares or sleepovers or things like that. Even at recess time at school, we have seen things like this happen. So I think parents need to be very, very aware. And before we even consider a child having a sleepover, we have to talk about tricky people. We have to talk about boundaries. We have to talk about body safety. Like, there are so many things that have to happen as a preemptive strike that kids feel comfortable and they understand these sorts of things. You've had to talk about pornography, online safety, like all of these things if you're going to launch your kid into this world.
And Tammy, I think that those conversations often, we actually got on social media, what is the right age to start sleepovers, right? Parents ask that. And I think, unfortunately, the blurry answer is it's going to be different for every child. And I think part of the reason is that we have to be able to have these conversations with our kids and have that dialogue where we can see that they're understanding, they're thinking, they're asking questions. And obviously our very little ones are not going to be ready for those bigger conversations. But I think once we can start to have those bigger conversations and see that our kids are actually integrating those conversations, not just like some lecture, we're coming in, chatting to them, having these big conversations. Once they integrate it, I think that that's then a sign that they're ready for sleepovers, because they know, I know where I am. I know what my boundaries are. I know when to call mom. I know what isn't right. Whereas I think when they're very little, it's obviously much, much harder for them to actually integrate those conversations and understand them.
Okay. So I think, I mean, for me, this is just personal. I was most comfortable when I had some control over the sleepovers. This was just me. It was going to be at my house. And that's how it was for the last 2 years, with a very select couple kids where I knew the parents. I have spent time with the parents. I know their values. I know their rules around screens. And even though they're in my home, I like to know what kind of child this is. I've spent time with them. I can see how they interact with my other kids. Like, so to put myself in the driver's seat so I could ensure safety, it started with the kids, coming to my house. And when I am hosting for my 11-year-old, which isn't often, but it does happen, I have this really concrete rule, which happens when any child comes to play at my house, is if they have a device, whether it's a phone or it's an iPad, we actually lock them up from the time they come to our house till the time they leave. And then if they want to, I have their parents' phone number. If they want to call their parent, they can. Like, they just have to come tell me and I'll check in with them. But locking up devices was really, really important to me because I just don't know what they have access to. I also do not allow kids to sleep in bedrooms or play in bedrooms with the door closed. So even if it's like a play date, they are not to be in small rooms with the door closed. That is like a hard no for me. Now, my 17-year-old's a little different. If she has friends over, she's almost 18. Like, she can have friends over with the door closed.
Yeah.
Maybe not her boyfriend. However, friends I don't worry about as much. So that is a big one. So they can play in the backyard, they can play in the living room, they can play in the basement, but there is no going into rooms with doors closed. And if they're going to spend the night, we always do a check-in to make sure, do you want to call mom? How are you feeling? Do you need anything? And I would pull that child away separately, not in front of other kids, whether it's a group or even with my daughter, for example. There's a check-in to make sure that they're feeling okay. And it's okay. I let them know it's okay if they want to go home. Just have to let me know. Mom and dad won't be upset. We've already talked about it.
I love all of those. So those are all things that obviously, like you said, you can control in your own home. As you
Mhm.
start to consider at around 11 or 12 to have your kid maybe sleep at a select few other people, how are you navigating those conversations?
Very awkwardly. I have had the most awkward conversations with parents over the last 2 months, especially after we did that one podcast interview. I think I've said no to a lot of parents actually because I don't know them and they've asked, can my kiddo even come over for a play date? And I simply don't know these parents. I'm like, no, but she can come here. And then I have to explain why. Simply, I need to spend time with those families. I want to know what kind of rules they have in their house. I've talked, had them over for coffee or a glass of wine, and I'll ask them about, screen time use. I'll ask them about like, where do the kids, if you were to have a sleepover, where are the kids sleeping? What's your rules around, bedtime? Like, where are devices stored if they're even stored somewhere. I'm trying to think what else we've done with
Mm.
those other families. I've asked how old the siblings are. So if there's a teenager in the home, how old are they? Because I'm a little more concerned about adolescents than I'm going to be worried about young ones. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but if we're looking at the risk of any sexual abuse, it's more likely to happen with a child who's a little bit older. So that's something I'm considering. Trying to think if I'm missing anything
Mm.
here, but questions I'm asking parents. Yeah, definitely the sleeping, the bedrooms, the tech, alcohol, guns is another one. I live in a rural area, so I actually want to know if they have guns in the home and where those guns are, if they have them. Are they locked up? So that's one
Mhm.
definitely to consider for kids.
Yeah. And so, Tim, what I love about that is that it's very mindful of those steps into sleepovers in other people's homes without actually just saying, okay, you're 11 or you're 12, then we have a quick phone call with the mom. It's saying that we're going to take this really slowly because I think part of that too is that you start to have a village of people who are helping raise your child together. So a few close friends does make sense where we go, okay, this is a family who I know that I trust. They have similar values to us. I can have these awkward conversations, and then they feel free to have those awkward conversations with me. But I'm kind of giving my child some wings, but just very slowly and very cautiously.
Yeah, and I think a couple moms in particular and I have had these conversations and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that." Like we've had kids over and I never thought to do that. And we've brainstormed other ideas of what we could do if our kids are going to participate in this. So that's really something that has kind of come out of this. It's been really good, I think, to if any parents are following this and they want to do this, is the more we start talking about it and we mention things like sexual abuse, access to pornography, things like that. Some parents just simply haven't thought of it. They're not bad parents. It's just off their radar because it's not something that we had to worry about maybe when we were young. And Tan and I are just immersed in this world. So I think it's really good that I hope you can take this and pass on these conversations to families that might be considering this.
Yeah, Tammy, I think too, if a family is defensive when we're asking these questions, it's probably a sign that it's not a good fit for a sleepover anyway. And I would rather deal with a little bit of feeling uncomfortable than send my child and just have this feeling of dread all night going, did I make a terrible decision?
Yeah. I know we did a sleepover recently for my daughter's 11th birthday, and we had 6 girls over. And we just didn't sleep because what our rule was, one, like the devices are locked up, and two, they're sleeping in the living room. And our bedroom is right above, like it's an
Yeah.
open concept. So anything that is happening, we can hear them, right? So I think if you're going to take this approach, with kids sleeping in a common area, you have to be prepared to keep getting up and checking on them because they're going to get into not wanting to sleep. They're being silly. They might, these kids who decided to go outside at midnight, we had to bring them back in because we live in the country and they were out with flashlights. And again, I think if you're going to do this, you have to be prepared to not get any sleep that night. If you're going to do
Mhm.
this, especially when they're younger, is to keep and being able to check on the other kids. So it's the same thing with the other parents that are kind of in our circle. They're like, yeah, we know if this happens, like we're just basically getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep if we're
Yeah.
committed to making sure this is safe for these kids and that they are
Mhm.
actually staying in the living room, right? They're not sneaking out. They're not going into bedrooms. They're not running outside. And I think at this point, if parents know that this is what they're getting into, they might just not want to do this at all.
Totally.
So
Totally,
that might
totally.
be something to consider because I just know it's a big commitment when we decide to do this.
And I think the other thing that I would say to parents is it's kind of what we see with technology is that very often parents start off with these like boundaries around technology and then they just dissipate over time. And I think, these questions are so important. And I think what worries me a little bit is that we might start off with them when our child is, let's say we say 11, they're ready for that. We start off with these questions, but then it just sort of disintegrates and dissipates. And then finally we're not doing them at all. But if this is something that we're going to do, let's hold that irrespective of if they are 11 or 13 or 15. That if this is something that we're saying to our child, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it with a lot of care. Let's keep that care there.
When we were developing 10, we were prepping that handout we made for parents on sleepovers. One of the things you had mentioned that was really good was giving a child like an exit strategy and then role playing what ifs. So if your kiddo is going to go to someone's house, they need to know how to get out of it if they're not comfortable or something happens. So what does that look like? Is it something they have to say that's in code to the host that other kids would understand what that was? Can they just ask for their device to call or ask the parent? I mean, my kid wouldn't take a device, but they would have to ask the parent if they could call me. And then you had said like role playing what ifs, like what if another child sneaks a device? What do you do? What if someone makes you uncomfortable? What would you do? And actually play it with them. Like, what would you say to that person? What does that actually look like? Actually have them do it. Not hypothetically, like pretend you're that other child.
And what a beautiful practice, right? Because kids are going to come up against these things. So it might not even be the sleepover, but I think sleepovers provide this perfect situation for us to say there are a number of different sticky situations in the world. Let's try this out together. What would this look like? What does it feel like? What would we say in these sort of situations?
And I think lastly, just before we kind of end this, is trust your gut. Like if something doesn't feel right, just trust it. It's not worth the risk. Like we have that intuitive kind of feeling for a reason. And I know there's been families I have met that I've been like, nope. And I can't even tell you why exactly. I can't put my finger on it. I'm just like, nope, not okay with that. That child is welcome to come to my house for a play date during the day when I'm home. But like, we're not going over there. We're not, there's something off. And I just never, maybe as a psychologist, I could maybe put my finger on it. But for this podcast sake, like there's just something off to me that just kind of my spidey senses go up and I'm like, I don't like this. And it's an awkward conversation to have with those parents. It really is.
Yeah.
Like to be able to have to say no to them and not really have a big reason other than just think we prefer, to know families really well. And we prefer play dates to happen at our home. And you might not be the most liked parent on the block after that, but it's about our kids' safety.
And I think I would just finish off too to say that not all rules have to be forever. So sometimes I think families will say like, oh, we said no sleepovers, but maybe things shift in time. And so with our girls, we always just say for right now, we don't do sleepovers. It's okay to shift as we have more information and as we kind of figure out a plan with how we're going to feel best letting our kids navigate the sleepover world.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's podcast. We hope that was really helpful and you feel more prepared if you're deciding to jump into the sleepover world, or maybe you feel really good about your no. And that's okay too. I think whatever works best for you and your family is the direction you need to go. So we're hoping we gave you some information to make an informed decision about that.
Thank you, everyone.